Good evening and welcome to the Healthy Debate. My name is Lindy Naughton. Our aim with this programme, produced by Health Freedom Ireland in conjunction with the Irish Inquiry, is to promote debate on issues relating to health in Ireland. We would like to make it clear that we have no agenda beyond seeking to present all sides of the argument so that you, the public, can make up your own minds about how to manage your health and your lives. Much of the material you see and hear on this programme is not available through mainstream media or channels. If you wish to support us and to spread the word, please press the share button on your screen now. We'll start this week with COVID-19 statistics for last week. That's January the 31st to February the 5th. Of 124,952 tests, 7,158 tested positive and 12 people were admitted to ICU. With the virus season having peaked in the second week of January, the numbers are dropping steadily, as they do every single winter. Let us also emphasise that of the 3,687 deaths associated with COVID-19 registered since last March, only 665 were not already diagnosed as being seriously ill. That's 0.014% of our population of 4.9 million. If you want to dig deeper, the facts are all out there. Look at hpsc.ie. COVID-19, lockdown and vaccinations continue to dominate the health agenda, unfortunately. We believe that the state and the mainstream media have failed in their duty to present all sides of the argument. Our guests tonight are well known to all COVID skeptics, and we're delighted to have got them together for this programme. Professor Dolores Cahill is sitting here beside me. She's a molecular biologist and immunologist with a long list of achievements in the world of science. We could spend the whole of the rest of the programme listing them. Ivor Cummins is a trained biochemical engineer and a specialist in problem solving. Professor Cahill and Mr. Cummins may be completely wrong in their analysis of the situation, but they have huge online followings and they deserve to have their voices heard. Currently, they are ignored by RTE, Newstalk, Virgin Media, Irish Times, Irish Independent, Examiner, Journal.ie, whatever you're having yourself, who all seem more concerned with scaremongering than giving a balanced presentation of the arguments. We're going to ask our two guests a series of basic questions so you'll be quite clear on what their views are on SARS-CoV-2 and on lockdowns. We invite you, our audience, to put your questions to our guests using the comment section below. We'll try and get to as many of them as possible with about 10 to 15 minutes left of the show. So we're going to go to Ivor first because he's going to have to leave earlier than Dolores. So we'll start. Our first question is quite simple. What are SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19? Explain. It's that simple. We're getting really simple here now.
Coronavirus family, there's four other major ones. They generally are lower impact, though they do cause occasionally significant deaths in care homes during the season. But this one's been a big hitter. And there's a lot of discussion and argument I won't get into here as to whether it was gain of function, laboratory created, or whether it's a natural occurrence. But anyway, that's the virus. SARS-CoV-2 is the name, and COVID-19 is the disease that a small percentage of the virus or who succumb to it will get to varying degrees.
Dolores, have you anything to add there?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Ivor. It's great to be on the show. And just to say that coronaviruses are seasonal viruses. Some viruses cause illness all year round, but coronaviruses have been known for decades to cause illness and symptoms between December and the end of April every year in the Northern Hemisphere.
Which would be colds. Our flus aren't coronaviruses, sure they're not. Am I right?
40% of, so it's called influenza-like illness. And some of the infectious agents, about 15% is influenza virus and 40% is coronaviruses. But coronaviruses are seasonal, causing illness and symptoms between December and April every year in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yes, so and the opposite in the southern hemisphere. So, as we all know, this virus has been so elusive that they've had to go out and hunt it down. So I'll ask next question, another simple one, is what are your views on testing, Ivor?
Well, my views on testing are that the PCR test is very problematic. It's not too bad during a real epidemic when you've got a lot of ICU and mortality impact. It generally is fairly faithfully reflects what's going on in your society. It's an absolute disaster during a summer off season when you get what I call the case-demic, where you're getting lots of positives but no real impact. So then it exaggerates everything. And in this winter resurgence, the PCR is reasonably reflects the activity of the virus. I think that's fair enough. I would overwhelmingly say we should be using rapid antigen because it's way cheaper, way faster, and you could realistically maybe use it to help shield the vulnerable, from care workers, etc. And the final thing I'd say is the WHO 2019 pandemic guidelines were very clear. Once a virus enters a population significantly, and here it's endemic, so we're way past significant, right? There is no real value to test and trace. There's just no real point. And that's the WHO culmination of 50 years of science in their October 2019 guidelines, which they decided to utterly turn upside down in February because apparently China did a great job on this with lockdowns and stuff.
What do you say, Dolores, to our testing policy?
So I entirely agree with Ivor. So, these viruses circulate every winter. Every region, people become exposed to them and immune within the winter season. So essentially, we're talking about last year's flu virus, coronavirus, 2019, 2020. So everyone would have been exposed between December and April 2020. So essentially, and everyone either has, is immune to it and won't have symptoms again. And also there are 26 preventions and treatments that are used, including Nobel Prize winning, vitamin D, C, zinc, ivermectin. Yeah, I know. But suppose the thing is, you have to say, if everyone can be prevented and treated from dying with the treatments that have been around for decades, there's actually zero need to be doing PCR testing. It's entirely unnecessary. But maybe just to add, I've been trying to have the PCR positive tests and negative sequence since the beginning in a lot of the worldwide associations that I'm in the World Doctors Alliance and with the World Lawyers Alliance. And so I decided in December to initiate a worldwide sequencing of the PCRs in the world.
Could you hold there, explain what sequencing is?
So just to say that my area is in diagnostics for 20 years, and so you would never, ever diagnose someone with just a positive PCR test or a negative. You would actually do DNA sequencing to see what is in the test, because it's well known that you can just get the primers, the constituents of the test can give false positive, or that if you amplify it up too much, you can actually specifically amplify up human DNA or some other type of DNA. So what you should be doing rigorously is in-depth forensic sequencing of the positive PCR tests. And so that wasn't happening in the world. And I'm very honored to be working with Professor Shin Lee in America, one of the leading world experts, and Professor Jack Lloyd Weber. And I'm leading the PR sequencing consortium to actually sequence what the PCR test is. And if the positives are adenovirus, rhinovirus, influenza virus, primer dimers from false positives, if they are the common cold or whatever, when we sequence it, if we find that information it's not SARS-CoV-2, it means that the premise of the legislation for public health emergency in the United States and around the world will fall apart, and then we will either be asking the governments or going to court to injunct the government to say there's no need for the lockdown because SARS-CoV-2 may not be circulating. It may be, but it may not be.
But does it, what I find, we could get into very arcane arguments here, which, most people won't understand, including me. But my understanding from reading it is that when you use the word sequencing, computers are involved. And I think an awful lot of the problems we've had with this whole thing has been, Ferguson and people like that who have just done, does that work?
No,
how does it
not
work
so
with
much
that?
in sequencing. I think
yeah.
the thing is, if you have healthy people with no symptoms, right? So in China, to be actually have a diagnosis of influenza, you have to have symptoms. So what has been missing really since May 2020 is that a lot of the fear-mongering and governments have been assigning disease diagnosis, as have doctors, for people that have no symptoms.
Yeah.
And so this has been perpetrated by the case numbers based on PCR sequencing, which not of people who are healthy. So we just have to say, this, we're talking about a flu. People in the wintertime have flu-like symptoms. There are prevention and treatments to prevent people getting sick and dying. And there's absolutely, it's a complete waste of money and entirely unnecessary to be doing testing on people who don't have symptoms.
Right. Ivor, this is getting very interesting and I'm wandering off my own points. But anyway, the whole thing, when they go on about the fact that flu has disappeared. Has flu disappeared, Ivor?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So I offered an alternative explanation for it. So it does appear that the testing for flu has dropped down massively around the world, and the WHO register, they have a Sentinel type program. The testing has dropped away because the only game in town now is SARS-CoV-2. Okay then. But there has been a reasonable amount of testing done, and it does appear to be showing a very low positivity rate. So if you go along with that, it looks like flu has kind of nudged back out of the virome as SARS-CoV-2 came in. Now, there may be a possible precedent for that. Dr. Hope Simpson, who wrote a stunning book, The Transmission of Influenza, he spent 50 years on the problem. He did note that many times a new strain comes in or a new virus, the old one can literally disappear. It just seems to drop out of the virome. So I wondered, was that effect occurring? It's only a hypothesis. But otherwise, it does not appear to be the lockdown or the mask wearing that has made the flu disappear, because even in Sweden, with no lockdown, no masks, right, the flu has apparently disappeared there as well, and in other countries with no lockdowns. So that's not the pat just so story. So it may be something complicated, like, viral competitiveness of some sort. Or otherwise, it's a bit of a mystery. And the last thing I'd add is rhinovirus has plowed ahead. In Germany, they've got higher percentage of rhinovirus than they did last year. So it's only the influenza that appears to have stepped aside.
So you mean by rhinovirus, you mean a cold? Am I right?
No,
Yeah, another form of cold type virus. Yeah, but you can see in Germany, the rhinovirus has humped right up. It's more a summer season one. It's been unaffected totally by lockdowns, masks, hygiene. So it's kind of a control case. But it's the influenza particularly that seems to have dropped off the map.
Right. Well, we'll move on now to treatments that we mentioned, which are ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, that I hate saying, and other therapeutic drugs. So, Ivor, what's your stance on these kind of therapeutic drugs?
Yeah, I don't really focus so much on the drugs, and that's the general thing. Even when I was working on cholesterol and fat metabolism, it's all around fixing root causes. So I'd say vitamin D, whatever about supplements, getting your natural level up to around 35 nanograms per milliliter in your blood. And you can achieve that. I went through this back in April, actually. I did interviews and talks on this, specifically relating to COVID. So the early data came out and clearly showed there was a massive extra risk of ICU severity or death if you had a low blood level. And I made the point that you can raise your blood level by eating nutrient dense foods like meat, fish, and eggs, and less junk food. You can resolve insulin resistance, which is an epidemic in the Western world, and your D level will rise in your blood. Or you can get sun exposure, healthy, or take supplements. Many ways to raise your D level. But it seems absolutely compelling, and a couple of RCTs have come in from Spain as well, indicating this, that getting the D level up could blow away many other interventions. And yet we saw zero focus, and we even saw the FDA in June put an injunction in against two websites, I think, that were just discussing vitamin D's importance. They were told to take them down. So that's been bizarre. On the drugs, I mean, I see the WHO now is approving ivermectin in a sense. New York is approving it. So it seems like as the vaccine finally comes in, suddenly the UK is now pushing vitamin D on elderly people. So it seems an extraordinary timing that all of these kind of mitigating treatments are all coming in just as the vaccine rolls. They could have all been pushed under emergency use back in April 2020. Why wouldn't you? Apparently, we had an emergency. So why weren't we using everything we knew? Don't know.
I just want to ask Ivor one more thing about the vitamin D. I mean, I've been a proponent of vitamin D myself because I'm involved in sport, and we all know that it helps with SAD, season, whatever you call it, affecting depression and all that. And so anyone, anybody who's aware of staying healthy in winter is aware, I would have thought, aware of vitamin D. But why do people have such low levels of vitamin D? I don't really understand it. Is it modern life, or historically did we have low levels of vitamin D?
Yeah, so there's great. I gave a talk on this. It was an hour and a half long back in 2014. I did a lot of research and I gave examples like the Maasai black people, the natural Maasai in their own environment, their vitamin D levels 45 for males and around 55 for females. That's the evolutionary level. But their genetic cousins, the Bantu, in the study living in the city, were down around 25, which is an enormous difference. And then you also had a study of athletes in Wyoming, males 45, females 55, and they were out in the sun, healthy, exercising and eating well. So the natural human level should be in the 40s, rough and tough. And that seems to be the level where you get a drastically lower impact from this virus. The reasons why we're lower, and in America, I think 70% of people are below 30. So it's an enormous problem. And dark skinned people are even, I think, only around 5% are above 30. So the problem is metabolic disease drives your D level in your blood down. Inflammatory conditions and autoimmune conditions similarly, and we have an absolute explosion of those with the chronic disease epidemic in the last 50 years. And people are not getting healthy sun because they were told to avoid it, which was absurd. You should just get as much sun as possible, but without burning your skin. But that's the only caveat. And generally, the foods, the nutrient dense ancestral foods, which had D and promoted low insulin resistance, promoted low leptin resistance, all those foods have drifted away and we've replaced them with processed foods, which are all junk. So it's not just McDonald's burgers and Coca-Cola that's junk. Bread is junk. It's a refined carbohydrate junk food. So if you put all those things together, the whole population D level has gone from ancestral 30s, 40s down, slumped down to the 20s. And 86% of elderly Italian women had, in a recent study, below 12 level. Now that's catastrophic level. 86% of elderly in Italy. Now we know what happened in Italy, don't we? And we know what happened in Japan. And a study in Japan showed that active elderly had 95% were above 30. So these are huge differences in metabolic health as reflected in the D value. And anyway, I listed the reasons we're down, and we could fix them all. You could fix them all in the 6-month program.
Right,
Dolores, well, I'm going to ask you about ivermectin and those kind of
Yes, I
therapies.
suppose I came out in May, exactly as Ivor said, the best source obviously to protect your immune system and boost it is food and nutrition and water and exercise, sunlight, but also to ensure that you have sufficient quantities of vitamin D, vitamin C and zinc. And then the real question is that, so vitamin D has a Nobel Prize, vitamin C has a Nobel Prize, and ivermectin has a Nobel Prize in 2015. Zinc is known to help boost your immune system. And on the World Health Organization, Essential Medicines of the World is hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. So as well as that, there's more than 20 other approved and licensed and regulated drugs that can help prevent illness and death from SARS-CoV-2. So therefore, when you look at that, there is no need for any of the lockdown. These were all approved a year ago. And as Ivor said, I agree completely, vitamin D on its own would affect 85%, would prevent 85% of the deaths of the elderly associated with SARS-CoV-2. So really the politicians and the doctors and the science advisory groups in Ireland and around the world should be asked, why didn't you tell people that you can protect yourself? There's no need for the lockdown, mask, social distancing. And why didn't you tell the elderly to go out and walk and get sunlight?
Is this not a historic problem that medicine generally fixes you afterwards rather than going to the, as Ivor was saying, the root causes?
Yeah, I suppose what we should use is use the time period now that we have associated with these lockdowns for people to learn that really there's been a failure of the medical community and the governments and the media to actually inform us to not be afraid, and how we can boost our own health by eating well, and looking after ourselves and asking our doctor, why can't you give preventative doses of hydroxychloroquine and zinc?
Can you buy them over the counter in Ireland? What's the story?
So my understanding is in Ireland there was guidance in May 2020 to say to the pharmaceutical industry and to the doctors to, even though it was approved and regulated, that they should be anxious about prescribing it. And it's the same in Australia, for example. Doctors can get 6 months in prison for prescribing hydroxychloroquine, but it's one of the safest drugs in the world and it's been approved worldwide. So this is the questions we should be asking.
Yes, Stephen is asking us to take a 30-second break so we can fix the audio. So if you could just bear with us for 30 seconds, please. Right, we're back. Apologies for that. We've got brand new, wonderful equipment, but it's not quite working as we would hope. Okay, we were talking about the therapeutic drugs that you can buy, and Dolores was telling us that you could get prosecuted in some parts of the world for prescribing them.
But hydroxychloroquine is one of the safest drugs in the world, and it's been around for 50 years. And it was actually the first time in America with the FDA that they ever withdrew a drug that was regulated and licensed, and it's been around for over 60 years, and it's the essential medicine of the world of the WHO, and it's used to treat malaria and diseases like lupus and arthritis, and it's still prescribed in Ireland for autoimmune diseases, but I'm not sure if they're prescribing it for the symptoms of influenza-like illness. It doesn't make any sense.
Could you explain, I mean, I looked up some of this stuff, and could you explain about, ivermectin is the new boy in town nearly, although it isn't. But is it that much better than hydroxychloroquine?
Well, they seem to be. I mean, hydroxychloroquine can be used as a treatment. So Dr. Zelenko developed his protocol for the prevention and treatment of COVID-19 disease, and he had 799 patients, all of the elderly, and he gave them combinations of hydroxychloroquine and zinc in their homes, and all of them survived. This was February and March, and I think 20 were hospitalized, but they all survived. So hydroxychloroquine and zinc have been known to be safe and effective in the Dr. Zelenko protocol since February, and also of last year. And there was clinical trials about a related drug that was useful in 2003 for similar type illnesses. And ivermectin got the Nobel Prize in 2015, and also has a complementary mechanism that it can prevent it. So you can actually use them in different therapeutic strategies, as well as ensuring that people have vitamin D, C, and zinc. And there are I think I was talking to Dr. Sherry Tempany today, and she says there are 26 drugs that are licensed already last year that are known to prevent and treat symptoms of SARS-CoV-2. So that is the real question, because if you can prevent and treat it, there's absolutely no need for the lockdown, quarantining, masks, social distancing, and testing. Yeah.
And testing. Yeah. Well, that's the big dilemma. We'll get onto that in a little while. The next topic would be lockdowns. So, Ivor, could you summarise your views on lockdowns? And we've now a year of them.
Yeah, it's 3 weeks to flatten the curve, eh? It's nostalgic. So it's just the most bizarre phenomenon. So again, 2019 WHO guidelines, pandemic guidelines, comprehensive document. They are clear as day. There is no point once a virus is out and about in a community to isolate exposed individuals. They're very clear. It's said 3 or 4 times. Never mind locking down whole societies, including the healthy. So we have around 30 published analyses now, some peer-reviewed, some in journals, some from universities. Doesn't matter. They all say the same thing, and I have them on my website. Lockdown is extremely ineffective, really, overall, and the costs are enormous. If you take the costs on our freedoms alone and on the principles of freedom, that alone would knock them out, because the benefits are so minimal. So if you add in the disastrous collapse of economies and the economic determinants of health and the depression, suicides, missed cancer screenings, yada, 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 they're the worst cost benefit intervention, I think, in history, because in history we never did irrational things. 2020 is where irrationality became the norm. So that's my opinion on lockdowns. Now, there's a couple of good studies as well, model studies, but not the from Imperial, good modeling. And they model it and show that if you shield the under 60s and do lockdowns, you'll maximize the COVID-19 death, because you'll minimize community immunity in vast swathes of the population that are not going to be impacted anyway. And you'll put granny and grandad at risk in the next season and generally. So there's one in the BMJ that indicates that, and another one that's a preprint. But the point is, even besides the enormous societal damage of lockdowns, there is good science to suggest you'll maximize even COVID-19 deaths by not shielding the elderly and susceptible, and rather trying to shield everyone. So it's just really horrific what's happening, I think, and there is no discussion allowed. And that's the other terrifying thing. There is no discussion of any of what I just said. It's simply not allowed. So science can only survive, can only flourish by debate. But debate has been kind of banished. So it's the craziest thing. And I often say to people, lay people, just think of it logically, right? Just think of it logically. Cuomo in New York, they had a hard lockdown for many weeks. And Cuomo, the governor or whatever he is, he came out and he was astonished that 68% of the new infections were people who were isolating at home. Couldn't understand it. But the reason is lockdown of whole populations just doesn't really work like we intuitively think it would, right? And if you even think in Ireland in April, in the middle of the epidemic with no masks, the grocery workers were indoors with the great unwashed coming in and out. So the grocery workers were the opposite of lockdown. They were an incredible control group who were ultra exposed 8 hours a day. And guess what? There were newspaper articles on it. They didn't see any extra infection or mortality, even accounting for age. So that alone shows you the lockdown is minimally effective, along with the 30 studies. And yet here we are a year later with an endemic virus in a winter resurgence that's seasonally coming down all over the place, independent of lockdowns. And we're still doing them. In fact, we've doubled down. The world has almost doubled down on lockdown. So as a technical expert and 30 years in problem solving, the data screams at me. It tortures me. So I see this as politics now. That's the only explanation. It's not science. It can only be politics.
Happy to agree with everything that Ivor has done, and I have to commend all the excellent work that he's been doing for the past, for many years, but for the last year. And I think what some of us would have known is if you look into what's going on in the various pandemics, this is the 8th pandemic. There's similar cycles around, exaggeration of the deaths associated with certain viruses, and then the treatments have not been communicated. So I think really what people need to realize is that this is more or less a political or an attack on our freedoms, and that it really is that we have to hold people to account. So why are the politicians doing this? Why are the doctors not giving prevention and treatment that would prevent death? And why are the media really in Ireland not actually discussing it? So I think part of why I'm very honoured and set up the World Freedom Alliance with Dr. Adil and Dr. Zach Cox as president of the World Freedom Alliance is that in these groups we have pillars of, lawyers and doctors and scientists and innovators and people who actually in media and whistleblowers, is that we have to really learn what is going on, is an attack kind of on the fundamental structures of our society, on freedom of speech and on small businesses, and that people have to push back and potentially have free speech platforms like this. Consider, standing for election, and consider taking precedents and legal cases to actually ensure that they can't perpetuate this for years to come.
I'll tell you what's been frightening me is that I've always expected things not to go quite as expected in Ireland. And I think at the moment we're just in lockstep with SAGE, as far as I'm concerned, is really running the country. But what I do find frightening is that sane countries like not Sweden, of course, we know they're completely sane, but Germany, France, Spain, Italy, I don't know about, but they're countries that I would have regarded as far more rational in their approach to, as Ivor was saying, that they would have looked at the cost effectiveness, they'd have looked at the side effects. Why is it that all the governments in the Western world are treating this in the same way, with the honourable exception of Sweden?
Yeah, and maybe I'm in touch, in the World Freedom Alliance with many countries. So countries like Tanzania are perfectly fine and they have no aspect of the lockdown. And in Brazil, I'm in touch with the Brazilian government and President Bolsonaro hasn't done it. And we see even in some states like Florida in America. And it turns out, as Ivor said, there is no, those countries actually have often less deaths. So I think what we need to do is kind of have an accountability project, because it turns out a lot of the things that, has been done in Ireland are actually making people sick. and causing more death. And one of the, the lockdown is entirely unnecessary and causing more harm than good. And masks for everybody is actually reducing their oxygen supply. And you need oxygen to be healthy. It's not rocket science. And really, it has to be laid at the doctors and the Minister for Health is why are they not communicating there are prevention and treatments, and why are they not making them available? So
you've just mentioned the next topic, which is masks. Ivor, what's your stand on masks?
Masks, yeah. The challenge we're talking about masks is lockdowns, everyone knows they're really destructive. It's palpable. So you're slightly allowed to criticize them. But masks you're not, because masks are easy. But I'm a purist. I'm a scientist. So I say if the science does not support any credible advantage of masks, then there is zero justification for prison sentences and fines. And that's a principle. See, everyone has forgotten about principle. I don't care if they're easy to wear. It's wrong to force the wearing of a mask, especially when it was brought in midsummer. So I had told my wife, by around May, this thing's going to collapse and they're going to have to back off in this lockdown nonsense. And they began to slowly. And my darkest day of the whole year on this was in June when they started talking about mandatory masks, because I said, hold on a minute. It's come to pass exactly as I said in Europe. The ICUs are emptying, the deaths are falling off the map, and these guys are going to have to give up until next winter, whereupon it will rise again. But they brought in prison sentences and fines in July all over Europe. Now, when you bring in something that ruins people's freedoms under pain of law, you'd better have a goddamn good science behind it, because that's a serious thing to bring in mandatory masking. That's a big deal. But they brought it in when nothing was happening and with no exit strategy. Because if you bring in mandatory masks in the nadir of a seasonal virus when nothing's happening, what in the name of God is your exit strategy? I mean, no one stopped to think about that. So the middle of the winter, you say, look, for the next month or two, while things are tough, we want you to wear masks. You could argue it, but that's not what happened. And one other thing I'll add, that all that long summer when they were bringing in mandatory masks and all kinds of other restrictions and maintaining them and threatening a Spanish flu type second wave in the autumn, a huge impact. Remember all the threats, terrorizing? They didn't do a single thing to expand the hospital capacity or cross-train ICU staff for their threatened Armageddon. They did nothing. They actually took apart the Nightingales and they disbanded the City West in Ireland. So while they were threatening us with an Armageddon, and that's what it was, Spanish flu second wave, they were referring back to that. At the same time, they were doing nothing to prepare for it. Now, what does that say to someone with a little bit of a brain even?
Well, I just want to add in as a bit of a historian that in 1918 the flu has been used as a typical example. It was not typical because the world had just come through 4 years of World War, that my relatives were from my Scottish side were in the trenches. There was chlorine blowing around all over the place. The world was in a very unhealthy state, and it just annoys me when they keep comparing it back to 1918. 1918 was an exceptional pandemic, which it was, but it wasn't caused by the flu. It was caused by the circumstances of the time. Sorry,
I might just add one quick thing, and I don't want to hog it, but I sent out a short 2-minute video on Twitter to explain to people, you must look at quality adjusted life years. If a disease kills people at the life expectancy, you've got X amount of life years lost. If you compare COVID, it's no worse in excess mortality per year than of several years in the last 25 or 30. And also the 1980 flu, under 60s were the lion's share of the people who died. So the life years lost were vast compared to this. Rough and tough, you could argue the life years impact of Spanish flu might be around 200 times COVID-19. It's maybe 10 times the deaths or something, you can argue, but it's a couple of hundred times. And pregnant women, mothers, people in prime of life, infants, children, the Spanish flu cut a swathe through them. This disease, it's incredibly marked by being heavily stacked to average age 80, median 85. It's incomparable to the 1918. It's not in the same universe.
Right, I think, Ivor, I know you've to leave in a short while, but we'll go on to another contentious issue, which is travel. What should we be doing about travel? Ivor, you can go first.
Okay, travel. Well, back to the WHO guidelines, they're clear, and it's for influenza, some people say, but bar a difference in the R number, it's the same principle. So there's no point if all of Europe is not only sozzled with SARS-CoV-2, which it is, but it was last April, and now it's endemic and it's everywhere and the season's coming down. What in the name of God is the point to get all anal about moving around Europe from country to country? It makes no sense. And the WHO themselves in 19 called that out. There is no point doing border closures or travel restrictions once it's out and about, never mind endemic. So I just say rapid antigen tests, if you must, do rapid antigen. You know, they're $5 or $10. You get the results within 20 minutes. And if you want to be super controlled, you got rapid antigen. But what's all this kind of hysteria around travel? I don't understand it.
Yeah, so maybe, yeah, I agree completely. So I suppose the thing is, we have to actually say, you know, for every intervention governments do, or the healthcare system, like Ivor says, is there any scientific or medical basis for it? So I would say, you know, we have a beautiful immune system. People have been exposed to coronaviruses. The vast majority of people, probably 999 people out of 1,000, are already immune, and there are prevention and treatment. So basically, there is no need for the lockdown, quarantining, masks, nothing. In fact, there never was, right? So therefore, we have to look at the lawful basis that the governments can actually infringe on our inalienable rights of freedom to travel, freedom of speech, bodily integrity. And really, even just the PCR testing and travel is an infringement on our freedom to travel, you know, and our bodily integrity, because under the inalienable rights of bodily integrity, no one can actually do anything to your body without your consent. And I've been traveling around and detained by police because they are forcing you, you know, to actually get you on a plane to try and coerce you into either providing unlawfully private health information or requiring you to you know, coercing you into a test that you don't consent. So I suppose what I would say really the broadening out is that people need to be aware that we have inalienable rights, you know, from the natural law, or comes from English constitutional law, and equity is enshrined in the Constitution, that no government can actually inhibit your freedom of travel, freedom of speech and bodily integrity.
Ivor, we're aware you have to leave. I have a question here, and the phone has gone blank on me, but I remember what it said. It said, we're very aware that our government is infringing on our rights. What on earth can we do about it?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, last year I would have said various things. At this stage, I mean, there's such mass psychosis from the media now, over 12 months, that the population is literally psychosed. And it's very hard to say, because if you try and push back on this now, you've got people who were previously sane who will screech at you. It's a challenge. I mean, what my tack is to share some of what I shared tonight and much more, and try and get people to understand the basics around the ineffectiveness of lockdown, and the impact of this virus is maybe around 0.1%, heavily stacked to the aged. I mean, I try and tell people things like, there's a study in Japan that no one in the media will talk about, and it's the study I would have done first in March as a problem-solving engineer. And what they did was they took a few hundred Tokyo people, they had no lockdown, and they had the masks, but we know that they're marginal at best, and they tracked them and test them for antibodies every week or two through the hump in PCR when Japan in Tokyo had their kind of epidemic. And you know what? Those several hundred people went up to nearly 50% antibody positive for SARS-CoV-2. And that just shows you, like, Tokyo had very little impact because of the metabolic health and T-cell cross-immunity in the population probably, and other factors. But nearly 50% of people didn't just get exposed, didn't just get a T cell response, they got a full antibody positive. So Tokyo was riddled with this, but everyone in the world thinks they somehow dodged it. They didn't.
Do you have to go now, Ivor?
I got another couple of minutes. No, I can push it tight.
Wait till we see.
And maybe I should just... That's because they have an immune system,
oh, yeah,
right?
sorry, Dolores.
No, just to
I'm
say that
obviously
that people have an immune system, right? Coronaviruses circulate all the time, and it's our immune system that protects us. So even if you take vitamin D or C or have any treatment, it's that you have an immune system, and that actually comes across these coronaviruses and can protect you. And it just is boosted every year or every second year, you know?
Yeah, most of the questions are pretty much on the same line, which is, what can we as ordinary citizens do tomorrow to try and get us out of this? Flip it, the phone is going in.
It's a tough one because you need to convert people using facts. I mean, there's a lot of material out there, as Dolores said. There's groups all over the world. I'm engaged with Pandata in South Africa, another group in Denmark, the Heart organization in the UK, yada yada, and the ones Dolores mentioned. They are providing all the material you need to become educated, and then you have to try and convert other people or de-psychose them. I mean, I was 15 years in people management as well as technical leadership, and it can be very hard to turn people around when their brains have become almost impaired in a way with a psychological belief or a conviction. But everyone has to do their best to convert people, and it's not easy. Because like I say, I consider a large proportion of Irish people now, in a sense, to be psychologically damaged by 12 months of relentless propaganda. And these people don't want to change their worldview. They have a fear of the experts being wrong. You know, and you get this question, how can all the experts be wrong? Well, Patton said it, General Patton. When everyone's saying the same thing, you know, somebody isn't thinking. Or when everyone's thinking the same thing, somebody's not thinking. We've had many examples in history where everyone was wrong. You know, the ulcers, that guy who said it was due to that bacteria or whatever, he had to inject himself with the bacteria to prove it. You know, we had Semmelweis with the pregnant women dying because the surgeons were doing autopsies, not washing their hands. Everyone thinks because we live in a modern technological world that all that's gone. But there's still conspiracies, there's still corruption, there's still groupthink. And this one is the mother of all mass psychosis groupthinks, in my mind.
I think the biggest problem is I stopped looking at television a few years ago because I had a dispute, nothing honourable, I had a dispute with Virgin, and I haven't missed it at all. And when I'm staying with friends, I'm really aware of the kind of propaganda that's coming out from RTE, which is absolutely, I mean, I can't watch it. It's awful. So, I mean, as a journalist, I don't know how we can, you know, I often say I'm only a journalist. You've got to deal with the editors, and then you've got to deal with the owners, as far as I can see. I don't know if either of you had any experience with the mainstream media.
Yes,
Dolores,
I mean, I've had lots of articles that have been untrue, right? And they might give you, I know the Irish Times gave me less than 4 hours to respond. And of course, if you want to challenge them, you'd have to go to court and have a lot of money. So there isn't really. And then when I asked to write an article, they said no, that wouldn't be actually something that would do. So I think what we need to do is realize what's going on. But I do have a lot of hope. Because really, for maybe 10 or 20 years, the debate and freedom of speech issue around lots of aspects in our society has been blocked. So, and also maybe on another positive note, you only need about 1 or 2% of a population that can actually shift the dialogue. So, you know, that you can actually, would say, if we were to take legal challenges that would say, for example, sequencing the positive PCRs, if they're not SARS-CoV-2, that means the whole legislation in Ireland is not correct, right? Because it's based on SARS-CoV-2. And then it would be that people can wear the masks, but the police cannot be enforcing the restrictions. And then over time, people would stop wearing the masks and life would go back to normal. But I think what we need to do is use this opportunity to take a fundamental look at the political system and the media and the health and the education. But the solutions would be things like people actually standing for election and setting up new media companies like the Irish Inquiry. And I'm involved in a media company in the UK now, Happens.network, and we're behind the new normal. And we actually want to give people, you know, a right of reply, or to actually develop stations that will do the news and collaborate with like the Irish Inquiry.
Okay, Ivor, I think you are going to have to go now, but have you a final word to say about the mainstream media?
I was just thinking as Dolores was being there, I often bring up thought experiments, and I would never compare myself to Einstein, but he was very good for thought experiments. And I would say a thought experiment, if you went back in time to February 2020 and you magically froze the WHO and a few other international bodies, and all the governments had to kind of link up with each other and just work through this, none of this would have happened. Likewise, if you had media people magically transported from the 60s or 70s and populated the whole media, somehow magically, none of this would have happened. So there's a whole series of different ways you could look at the world where this would simply never have happened. I would even go as far as to say, if you took the people, the population from the 60s or 70s, somehow magically, and populated the world of 2020, they never would have bought it. So I think we have a problem in our population after 30 years of safism and ridiculous issues that have been highlighted, and the fracturing of society, and I think we've become a people ripe to be harvested by a lot of this nonsense. And it's just another way of thinking about it. We have a lot of problems in the modern world, and that's why we're in the mess we're in with this one.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ivor. I think we'll say goodnight to you now.
Thank you, Ivor. Brilliant.
Dolores, I've got...
Bye-bye, Ivor. Lovely to talk to you. Take care.
I have a great one. I have a great one here. This gentleman has sent us a question saying that he got COVID-3, what am I talking about? He got COVID, sailed through it with vitamin D, C, zinc, etc. But at the same time, he was worming his cats, dogs and himself with something called Vormox. It's an anti-parasitic. Could this inadvertently have worked on me like ivermectin?
Because I know ivermectin is actually used around the world for getting rid of parasites. And actually, I think it's one dose, over a couple of days, or one dose, and you can actually get rid of a lot of the parasites and viruses. So ivermectin is shown to be, as is hydroxychloroquine, actually has been shown by Dr. Simone Gold, and the American Frontline Doctors. They have, if you look at the AmericanFrontlineDoctors.com, it can actually be useful in treating the symptoms of 15 different autoimmune diseases, as well as malaria. And I think what's good news is that for every flu now, that everyone, including the elderly, should know that vitamin D, C and zinc, and preventative doses of hydroxychloroquine, it has a half-life of 3 weeks, for like about €4, can actually help people to overcome illness and death from flu.
Yeah, but I think, Dolores, we wouldn't be recommending that people worm themselves.
Well, ivermectin, though, is a way of getting rid of parasites, just so you know. So that's one of the...
Come on, lads, please don't do it.
Exactly.
Unless you've got your vet's advice.
Exactly.
It doesn't even need a doctor.
But that is that's a Nobel Prize winning treatment. So, even if you take it for flu-like symptoms, it has other positive effects.
A friend had told me that they'd used it on their cows or something. I said, no, thank you. I'm just looking at some of the questions that have come in. I have no idea how... I'm going to throw this one at you. What are the implications of blood transfusions from a vax person to a non-vax person?
Now, that's a very interesting one. So I suppose there are 64 vaccines, in approval.
Right.
7 of them are mRNA, messenger RNA, so really they come under gene therapy. 0 mRNA gene therapy or vaccines were approved up until September 2020 because they did studies and they caused much more adverse events. So for me, obviously, I would not want to be involved. I think it's like Russian roulette, the messenger RNA vaccines, because they seem to, in the American figures, about 1 in 50 people had severe adverse events within 5 days. And that there seems to be much higher adverse events in the first week or two than I would have ever expected. but the real adverse events come in maybe in the weeks and months of the next flu season. So I personally would not want to be getting a blood transfusion from someone that had the mRNA.
Right, wait till we see if there's anything else here. There's a question about excess mortality, which no, there hasn't been excess mortality.
So in Ireland in 2020, it was the lowest overall death in the last 10 years of any year in the last 10 years. So really, people in a common sense way would have expected if there was an infectious disease causing death, it would be an excess death. And it wasn't. So Ireland in 2020 had the lowest death numbers.
Can you explain that at all?
So that doesn't make any sense. And also we know, like what Ivor was saying, because of the way they put people with influenza-like symptoms into the care homes, and because they did not make prevention and treatment available, and because they put some people on ventilators unnecessarily causing them harm and death, and that they haven't actually diagnosed or treated cancer properly. And there was, I think in the UK, significant numbers of deaths from cardiovascular disease because people were afraid to go into the hospitals. So there's a huge amount of factors that would have caused increased death, but still overall in Ireland in 2020, it had the lowest number of deaths in the last 10 years. So therefore, there is no justification at all for the lockdowns. It was entirely wrong.
It's extraordinary.
And I suppose people have to be held to account for that. You know, because it is actually criminal activity on behalf of the politicians and the government that if it is well known that there was no need for the lockdown and that if they prevented, treatment being available and there was unnecessary deaths, that actually that is a crime of malfeasance, right? That they actually were doing policy decisions that caused harm and death. And I think what's not mentioned is the unemployment caused by the economic consequences, because if people have unemployment, for every percentage increase in unemployment, you're going to have knock-on deaths due to depression, poverty, malnutrition. So I think we need to start talking about every week that goes by or every month, on average, everyone in Ireland loses a month of life, right? So for every year of the lockdown, everyone alive in Ireland has one less year of life expectancy. There's real harm because of the lockdown. And as soon as the government stops making these payments to small businesses, there's nobody paying tax to fund the state. So people really need to kind of consider now engaging with their society back again and even the democratic system and stand for election, really.
Right. We're going to have to wind it up fairly quickly. There's just one thing. People are asking about the Panorama programme.
Yes.
So briefly, could you? What's the story or what's your
So I
view
suppose
on that?
I was one of about 30 doctors. So it was Ask the Experts, and this was done by the World Doctors Alliance and people in the World Freedom Alliance. And it was advertised as if it was to discuss with Professor Dolores Cahill around vaccines. But I really only knew what the advertising was from the BBC, and I know they contacted me, the journalists, and I said, will it be a balanced program? And will I have any input to see what you're going to say about me? So they said no. So then I said I didn't want to be involved in it. But then I wasn't sure it was going to be potentially an expose about me or whatever. But in the end, obviously I sent them a drafted notice of liability that if they defamed or libeled me, obviously they would have to correct it. So in the end, I watched it not knowing. It was advertised as if it was about me. But in the end, I wasn't there at all. But essentially, it was an unbalanced program because even though they refer to, many doctors, we have hundreds of thousands of doctors, and I'm president of the World Doctors Alliance, there was no discussion about why were doctors putting their reputations on the line around why hydroxychloroquine wasn't there or the adverse events associated with the vaccine. They hardly mentioned adverse events at all.
Well, I think my own view of Panorama, since it went to half an hour, it doesn't have time to do the thing, to do anything comprehensive on any subject. Right, well, we've run over our time here. So we'd like to thank Dolores, Professor Dolores, and just plain Ivor for coming on to this programme. Is he a doctor? I don't know. Because it's been very stimulating. I hope you agree, and I hope you agree that we are doing a worthwhile job in giving a platform to alternative views, which we will continue with your help, I hope. The programme is organised by a group of volunteers. We're all here in this room. I'd be more not to name names because of the trouble we were having earlier. And but we'd like to thank everybody for their hard work, and we will get it right next week, will we, Peter and Danny?
And I'd like to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity as well. It's great to actually be on a media format, you know, and I'm very happy to thank you. And
thank you, Dolores. I'm embarrassing them now. Anyway, if you want to support us, the equipment that we have does cost money. So if you want to support us, please, there are ways of contributing. Just if you look at the Irish Inquiry website, there are ways of donating. You don't have to. If you're not earning any money, that's fine. We're delighted that you're listening. If you have any ideas for future programmes, or if there's people you'd like us to contact, to chat to, please get in touch. We are the only forum allowing for this kind of debate, and I hope that you do appreciate that it's hard work for us, and we appreciate that you're watching us, and in increasing numbers. And we will look into the legal. I'm hoping we'll have a good programme on the legal implications of all this soon. So for the meantime, I better just shut up and say thank everybody involved again, and we'll see you this time next week. Good night.
Good night.